Like many of my colleagues, I've been deeply disturbed by legal developments over the past few years and by what I think were the inevitable consequences of those decisions, particularly with regard to unrestricted campaign spending. As Professor Raskin just commented, Buckley versus Vallejo established a principled framework for evaluating how and to what extent spending might be fairly characterized as speech and therefore entitled to protection under the Constitution, and when it might be appropriately restrained. Recent decisions, however, have lost all sight of that balance and of the importance of that balance and of the consequences of destroying that balance. And in my view, the recent Supreme Court majority opinions seem singularly focused on whether a specific person or corporations intended giving constitutes quid pro quo corruption, while failing to consider other forms of corruption that are corrosive of our political order, that undermine public confidence, and that distract the deliberative workings of legislative bodies at all levels. The cumulative impact of money, particularly secret money and big money on politics, I think is very negative. And we need to work in a bipartisan way to find a responsible solution to this challenge. If you look at the trajectory of recent decisions, I think we're just 1 or 2 decisions away from the removal of all limitations whatsoever. So if I could, first, Senator McKissick, I just would be interested in your comments on what the elimination of restrictions presented through Citizens United, what has the impact of that been on your district, on politics in North Carolina, on campaigns, using North Carolina as an example in Austin versus Michigan Chamber of Commerce. Now, some years ago, the Supreme Court held Congress's interest in ensuring that expenditures that reflect actual public support for political ideas espoused by corporations justified a prohibition on political spending by corporations. They were concerned that corporations not be able to drown out the actual free speech rights of real living people. Post Citizens United, what's the ground been like in North Carolina, and what have the consequences been?
The consequences have been grave, to say the least. I mean, what you really have unleashed is the capacity for these independent expenditure organizations to come in, some of which are based in North Carolina, many of which are based outside of North Carolina. They're having impact on our Council of State races, our legislative races, judicial races, you name it. And what you really see is simply a barrage of negative ads that are run literally around the clock that disproportionately highlight some specific issue that they think is narrowly based. But the design of these commercials, all of these barrage of commercials, is simply to elicit an emotional response among persuadable voters. And unfortunately, at times, it's doing so. It's having exactly that impact. So, I mean, you find that perhaps these deep pocket corporate donors, whether they're millionaires or they're coming from outside the state, perhaps even billionaires on occasion, they have a vested self-interest. Many of them are highly conservative. Many of them do not perhaps share the mainstream perspective as the vast majority of North Carolina voters. I'm not going to tell you that North Carolina is a progressive state. I'm not going to tell you it's a conservative state. I'm going to tell you it's basically a centrist state. But when you have a centrist state with voters that are centrist in perspective pretty frequently, and you can see this massive amount of spending that's in interest in some situations 3, 4, 5 times the amount of money that individual candidates can put toward an issue or their campaigns, you see distorted outcomes across the board.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for that experience-based testimony about the impact of this flood of money on elections in North Carolina. Professor Raskin, if I might turn to you, I have a limited amount of time left. Mr. Abrams referenced that the First Amendment is an individual right that is protected, a right to free speech that's embedded in our First Amendment. Is it true that money equals speech in the context of the current majority in the Supreme Court and recent decisions? And what grounding do you think there is in the text of the Constitution for extending that right to corporations equally with individuals, and what's the consequence?
I think everybody would agree, or should agree, that money is not speech. Money can be a courier of speech. It can amplify speech. But we precisely because the First Amendment right is an individual right and not a collective right, that's why the Supreme Court had always said, up until Citizens United, that corporations as artificial entities chartered by the state governments do not have the First Amendment rights of the people. Justice Stevens put it, corporations don't have consciences, beliefs, feelings, thoughts, desires. And so there are three basic rationales for why we have a First Amendment. One is so people can express themselves. That obviously doesn't apply to a corporate entity. Two is for democratic self-government, so the citizens can govern themselves. But we certainly don't allow foreign governments or foreign corporations, and we didn't allow our corporations to take over that process. And the third is the search for the truth. But corporations are not interested in the truth. Corporations are interested in profit, as they should be, and it's been fantastically productive doing it that way. To bring the press into it just confuses the issue because we have a whole separate clause that defends freedom of the press, and they've never been regulated under our campaign finance laws and never would be. And they certainly wouldn't be under the constitutional amendment that's being suggested today.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you to the panel. I'll now defer to Senator Blumenthal.